The Arizona sun was a hammer and Dry Creek was the anvil. It beat down on the red rock and the thorny plains until the heat rose in shimmering waves, making the distant mountains dance and blur. This was a land that gave no quarter, a place of cracked earth and wind that carried more dust than promise. The year was 1883, and survival in this territory was a full-time occupation. For Abigail Boone, it was the only one she had ever known. Her world was the world of Water Station Number 3, a lonely outpost on the edge of town where the great iron locomotives of the railroad came to quench their thirst. At 26, Abigail was the station's keeper, its mechanic, and its sole resident. She understood the language of steam and steel better than the whispers of men. The hiss of a boiler was more honest than a sermon, and the solid heft of a wrench in her hand was more comforting than a handshake. Her life was measured in pounds of pressure per square inch, in the steady rhythm of the pump drawing water from the deep earth, a heartbeat she had come to prefer over her own. The town of Dry Creek kept a respectful distance, and so did Abigail. They saw the scar that claimed the left side of her face, a puckered, discolored map of a long-ago oil well fire that had taken her family. The scar pulled at her eye and twisted her mouth into a permanent, wry grimace. The children called her Ugly Abigail, and the adults, with their careful piety, simply looked away. She had learned early that her reflection was a thing to be endured, not examined. Her independence was a fortress built stone by stone from their averted gazes. She lived a quiet, practical life, her thoughts kept as close as the grease rag in her back pocket. The social order of Dry Creek was as rigid as the railroad tracks. Prudence Vale, the widow who ran the boarding house, was its self-appointed conductor. She policed the town's morals with a sharp tongue and a gaze that could curdle milk, her righteousness a cloak for a cold and grasping heart. Her chief ally was Sheriff Eli Cutter, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt and whose loyalty belonged to the highest bidder. The railroad paid well. Cutter saw Abigail's water station not as a vital artery for the trains, but as a prime piece of land. Land the railroad would pay handsomely for if only its current, disfigured tenant could be persuaded to leave. He made his desire known in small ways, a casual remark about the dangers of a woman living alone, a suggestion that the pump was getting old and unreliable, like its keeper. The soul of the town, what little it had, could be found at the bottom of a glass in Saguaro Jack's saloon. It was a place of dry humor and unspoken truths, where cowhands and prospectors washed down the dust of the trail with cheap whiskey. Abigail went there once a week for supplies, her face set, her eyes down, moving through the noise and smoke like a ghost. She would listen to the talk, gathering news like a bird gathers straw for a nest. On this day, the talk was of a raid up in the pass, a supply wagon, ambushed and looted. The driver was found with his head full of stories about Apache warriors, swift and silent, who vanished into the rocks. The word Apache fell into the saloon's dusty air like a spark on dry tinder. Fear was a currency in Dry Creek, and Sheriff Cutter was quick to spend it. He spoke loudly of retribution, of teaching the savages a lesson, his words puffing up his chest. Prudence Vale, sipping her sarsaparilla in a corner, nodded in grim agreement, speaking of the need to protect the good, God-fearing folk of the town. Abigail bought her flour and salt, paid her coin, and left. She knew the language of fear. It was the first language she had ever learned. That night, the wind rose. It came from the east, a hot, dry gale that picked up the red dust of the desert and hurled it against the world. The sky turned a bruised, angry orange. Abigail checked the gauges on her boiler, the familiar green glow of the dials a small point of order in the roaring chaos outside. She secured the latches on her tool shed and banked the fire in the pump house stove. The wind moaned like a dying animal, and the fine red dust found its way through every crack, coating everything in a gritty film. She was about to douse her lamp when she heard it, a heavy, scraping thud against the pump house door. It was not the wind. The wind cried. This was the sound of dead weight. She froze, her hand hovering over the lamp's key. The only visitors she ever had were the train engineers, and no train was due. She took the largest wrench from its hook beside the boiler, its weight a cold, hard comfort in her palm. Holding the lamp low, she cracked the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the wall. In the flickering, windswept light, she saw a man sprawled on her doorstep, face down in the dust. He was an Apache, his long black hair matted with dirt and something dark and wet. But he was not alone. Curled beneath his body, sheltered from the storm, was a small child, a girl with pale hair, her small form limp and still. For a long moment, Abigail did nothing but stare. Every warning she had ever heard, every fearful story told in the saloon, screamed at her to slam the door, to bar it and pretend she had seen nothing. This was the trouble the sheriff had been so eager to hunt. Bringing it inside was an invitation for the town's scorn to become the town's fury. They called her ugly. They would call her traitor, too. Then the man groaned, a low sound of pure agony, and the child stirred, letting out a whimper so faint it was nearly lost in the wind. Abigail looked from their desperate forms to the town, whose lights were now just faint, distant blurs through the red haze. The town had offered her no comfort. It had given her a name that was a curse and a life of solitude. She looked down at the two people at her feet, outcasts in the storm. She lowered the wrench. With strength born of years wrestling with iron and steel, she dragged the warrior inside. He was heavy, his body a mix of lean muscle and limp exhaustion. Once he was clear, she pulled the child in, her small frame feeling as fragile as a bird's. She bolted the door, shutting out the storm. The sudden silence in the small pump house was deafening, broken only by the man's ragged breathing and the steady thrum of the great pump. She laid them on a canvas tarp near the warmth of the stove. The girl was pale, but breathing steadily, lost in a deep, exhausted sleep. The man was another matter. There was a dark, spreading stain on his buckskin tunic. High on his shoulder, Abigail lit a second lamp, its clean, bright light chasing the shadows into the corners. With a knife, she carefully cut the tunic away. The wound was raw and ugly, but it was not what she expected. It was a clean, round hole, the kind a bullet makes, not an arrow, not a knife. Her hands, usually so steady when calibrating a pressure valve, felt clumsy as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and a strip of clean cloth from an old shirt. As she worked, she saw the bullet had gone clean through. Looking closer at the entry point, her mechanic's eye, trained to see the small details that meant the difference between a smooth run and a catastrophic failure, noticed something: the tearing of the buckskin, the way the wound was punched through. This was not the work of an old musket. It was a Spencer round, the kind of modern ammunition favored by prospectors, and she knew, by Sheriff Cutter's men, an Apache raiding party would likely have older rifles, if they had any at all. This fact settled in her mind, a cold, hard piece of certainty. The story being told in town was a lie. She finished binding the wound as best she could. The man had not stirred. As she watched him, his face stoic even in unconsciousness, the church bell began to toll. It was the alarm bell, its frantic, clanging peal cutting through the howl of the wind. They were forming a posse. They were coming to hunt the man lying on her floor. A few hours later, as the wind began to die down, the warrior's eyes opened. They were dark and intelligent, and they held no fear, only a weary watchfulness. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at her. "Water," he said, his voice a dry rasp. His English was broken, but the word was clear. Abigail brought him a dipper of fresh water from the pump. He drank slowly, deliberately. "Salt," he said next. She brought him a small pouch of it, and he placed a few grains on his tongue. His eyes cleared a little, and he seemed to gather himself. "I am Dasan," he said. He was a leader of a small band of the Chiricahua. He explained in short, clipped sentences. He did not say the title the townsfolk used. the sneering name of Apache King, but he held himself with an authority that needed no name. He looked at the sleeping child. Her name is Rose. He met Abigail's gaze. You have my life. I will repay. Abigail simply nodded. She had not acted for repayment. She had acted because the sight of them in the storm had touched the part of her that remembered being burned, being alone, being left for dead. The church bell had long since stopped, but Abigail could feel the town's fear and anger coalescing, turning into a single, hateful entity. Sheriff Cutter would be leading it. He would use this raid, real or imagined, to his full advantage. And now, she stood between the hunters and the hunted. She looked around her small, grease-scented sanctuary. The warm, yellow light of her lamps pushed back against the darkness. The steady, powerful beat of the pump was a comforting rhythm beneath the floorboards. Outside, the red dust storm of prejudice and rumor was gathering force. The flimsy wooden door of the pump house had become a line drawn in the sand, the boundary between a cold, hard world that had cast her out and the small, fragile warmth of the choice she had just made. She checked the bolt on the door one more time. It felt terribly small. The whiskey and cloth were a field repair at best. Abigail knew the warrior needed more if infection was not to set in and claim what the bullet had missed. There was only one person in Dry Creek she would trust, another soul who lived on the town's frayed edge, bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to be an outsider before the sun was fully up, while the wind still carried a spiteful chill. She slipped out of the pump house and made her way not towards the town proper, but towards the steaming, herb-scented building that housed the Dry Creek Laundry. Mei Lin Chen was a small woman with hands that were never still and eyes that saw everything. She had come to Arizona with a husband who now lay in the town cemetery, a victim of the same heat and dust that wore everyone down. She stayed, washing the grime from the town's linen, her silence and efficiency earning her a grudging respect. She and Abigail had an unspoken alliance, a bond forged in brief. Practical conversations over the exchange of clean rags for the pump house and mended clothes. Abigail found her feeding wood into the big laundry stove. Mei Lin looked up, and her expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. Abigail did not need to speak. Mei Lin wiped her hands on her apron and followed her out the back door, away from any curious eyes. Whispering quickly, Abigail explained the situation. The man, the child, the bullet wound that was not from an Apache rifle. Mei Lin listened, her gaze fixed on the middle distance, processing the information. When Abigail was finished, Mei Lin gave a single, sharp nod. She went back inside, emerging moments later with a small, cloth-wrapped package. It contained dried comfrey root, yarrow for the bleeding, and a clean roll of linen bandages that smelled of sunshine and soap. As she passed the bundle to Abigail, she said, her voice as crisp as starched cotton, "Strong women do not need to ask the wind for permission to act." Abigail took the package, the simple words a greater comfort than any prayer. "Thank you," she said. Mei Lin's only reply was a slight smile that barely touched her lips before she turned and went back to her work. Back in the pump house, Dasan was awake, sitting upright against the wall. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were clear. He watched as Abigail unwrapped the herbs, his expression unreadable. She prepared a poultice, her hands moving with the methodical care she usually reserved for stripping down a faulty valve. As she worked, she spoke, keeping her voice low. "The bullet, it was from a Spencer rifle, and the tracks I saw outside the door this morning, before the wind wiped them away, they were from cowboy boots with high heels, not moccasins." Dasan's gaze sharpened with interest. He watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "A blue cloth," he said, his voice stronger now. "The men who attacked the wagon, one wore a blue bandana over his face." "The Ridge boys," Abigail murmured, almost to herself. "Jack Ridge and his crew, they all wear blue bandanas, and Jack Ridge is Sheriff Cutter's shadow." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture as ugly as her own reflection. Cutter wanted the water station. A manufactured Apache raid would turn the town against any natives in the area. And more importantly, it would create chaos the railroad company would pay Cutter to control. Displacing her would be a simple matter of public safety. The silence that followed was heavy with this new understanding. To break it, Dasan spoke of his own people. He told her of old Coyote, his father, a shaman who carried the stories of their tribe. He spoke of their small band, no more than 24 people, who had tried to find a quiet canyon to live in, away from the soldiers and the reservations, wanting only to be left alone. His words were simple, yet they painted a vivid picture of a people caught between a world that was dying and one that would not let them be born. Emboldened by his honesty, Abigail found herself speaking of the fire, a memory she kept locked away like a dangerous machine. She did not share the details, only the result. She touched the scar on her face, a gesture of habit. "I am so ugly I could break a mirror," she said, the words tasting like ash, an old, bitter joke she told only to herself. Dasan looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "The mirror is weak. Not you," he said, with such simple, direct sincerity that it left her speechless. In all her life, no one had ever looked at her scar and seen weakness in anything but the object reflecting it. Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of approaching voices. Abigail peered through a crack in the wooden wall. A small group of townsfolk, led by Prudence Vale, was marching towards the pump house. Prudence's voice carried on the wind, sharp and righteous, speaking of the need to protect the innocent, of rumors of a captive child. She was stirring the pot, and Sheriff Cutter, who stood beside her looking grim and important, was more than happy to let it boil. They stopped a short distance away, their forms wavering in the midday heat. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a mechanic, not a fighter, but she looked at Dasan, his wounded shoulder a stark reminder of what these people were capable of, and at the sleeping form of Rose, and a cold resolve settled over her. Just as she was bracing for the inevitable knock on her door, a lone rider approached from the direction of the town. It was Sergeant Isaiah Brooks. He was a veteran of the Indian Wars, a former Buffalo soldier who now sorted mail at the telegraph office. He was a quiet, observant man who missed nothing. He dismounted and walked over to Abigail's pump house, ignoring the suspicious glares from Prudence's congregation. "Abigail," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not ask what was happening. He did not need to. His eyes, which had seen more than most men in Dry Creek could imagine, took in the situation at a glance. "Cutter has a warrant, signed it himself, says he has cause to search your property for a missing child. He is using that story about the raid. It is not a legal document, but he has the town behind him. They will be back tonight." The warning was delivered without emotion, a simple statement of fact. Isaiah tipped his hat, remounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Abigail with the cold certainty of what was to come. As if on cue, the sky began to darken. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, began to pick up speed, howling with a new fury. A vast, rolling wall of brown dust rose from the desert floor, a monstrous wave about to crash over them, a haboob, the desert's ultimate expression of its power. The world outside disappeared into a roaring, blinding maelstrom. Dust and sand blasted against the pump house, finding its way through every crack. The noise was immense, a physical assault on the senses. The boiler, Abigail thought, a surge of panic cutting through her fear. The air intake for the firebox would be clogging with dust. If it choked, the fire could die, the pressure would drop, and the pump would fail. Worse, if the flue got blocked, the heat could build up, and the whole thing could explode. She grabbed a wet rag and tied it around her face, then handed one to Dasan. "We have to keep the intakes clear," she yelled over the roar of the storm. Despite his injury, Dasan was on his feet. He understood the immediate, physical threat of the machine. Together, they fought the storm. It was a brutal, exhausting battle. They took turns, one holding a lantern and a metal shield fashioned from a sheet of tin, while the other cleared the vents of the choking dust. They worked in a strange, silent rhythm, a dance of survival against the screaming wind. He was surprisingly strong with his good arm, his movements economical and precise. In the heart of the chaos, a thread of trust began to weave itself between them, a trust born not of words, but of shared labor against a common enemy. In the midst of their struggle, a new sound pierced the storm's roar, a child's cry. Rose was awake, and she was burning with fever. Her small body was racked with shivers, and her skin was hot to the touch. The exhaustion, the fear, it had all been too much for her. The fight against the storm was forgotten. Abigail gathered the child into her arms, trying to soothe her. But Rose only cried harder, her whimpers thin and reedy. Dasan knelt beside them. He began to sing. It was not a song of words, but of soft, low sounds, a Chiricahua lullaby that rose and fell like the breath of the mountain. It was a song of deep, ancient peace, a sound that spoke of safety and home. Slowly, Rose's cries subsided, and her shivering lessened. Just then, the pump house door creaked open, and Mei Lin Chen slipped inside, a small lantern in her hand. She had seen the haboob and known they would need more help. Without a word, she knelt and placed a cool, damp cloth on Rose's forehead. From another pouch, she produced a paste of herbs, which she gently spread on the child's chest. The three of them, the scarred mechanic, the Apache warrior, and the Chinese washerwoman, formed a small circle of care in the heart of the storm, united in their effort to save the child. The haboob raged for what felt like an eternity, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind dropped to a low moan, and the world outside slowly reappeared, cloaked in a thick brown fog of settling dust. It was in this eerie, muffled silence that they saw it. Through the grime-covered window, faint lights bobbed and weaved in the distance. They were getting closer, the lanterns of horsemen. They were coming. Abigail rose to her feet. Her face was a mask of dust and determination. Her gaze fell upon the complex array of pipes and valves that controlled the boiler. Her eyes settled on a long, iron lever that operated the main steam release valve. It was a safety feature, designed to vent excess pressure in an emergency. But right now, she saw another use for it. A cloud of scalding, high-pressure steam would be a formidable weapon, one that could blind and burn without a single shot being fired. She walked over and gripped the lever. The iron was cool and solid in her hand. Outside, the lights grew brighter, resolving into a posse of armed men. Abigail stood her ground, no longer just the keeper of the water station, but its defender, ready to turn the very heart of her machine into a weapon to protect the lives she had brought in from the storm. The approaching lanterns cut through the dusty gloom. Yellow eyes in the dark. Sheriff Eli Cutter's voice, thick with whiskey and self-importance, boomed across the short distance. "Abigail Boone, you come on out. We know you have got that savage in there. Send out the child and no one else gets hurt." Behind him, several armed men fanned out, their shapes menacing and indistinct in the poor light. Abigail could make out Jack Ridge, his lanky frame unmistakable, and she could hear the shrill, righteous tones of Prudence Vale, who stood safely behind the line of guns, fanning the flames of fear. They have taken an innocent child, a devil's work. Inside the pump house, the air was tight with tension. Mei Lin held the sleeping Rose, whose fever had thankfully subsided into a deep, healing slumber. Dasan stood near the wall, his good hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his body a coiled spring of readiness. Every muscle in him was screaming for a fight. Abigail held up a hand, a silent command for him to wait. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was clear, clicking through options like the tumblers in a lock. She unbolted the door and opened it just a crack, leaving the chain on. The damp, dusty air swirled in. "I am not coming out. Sheriff," she called, her voice steady, louder than she expected. And I do not have anyone who does not want to be here. You want to set foot on this property, you come back with a warrant signed by a circuit judge." Cutter let out a harsh laugh. "A warrant!" He stepped forward, his belly jiggling, and patted the Colt revolver on his hip. "This is all the warrant I need. Now, stop playing games and send out the girl." From the murky darkness to the side of the posse, a figure stepped forward. It was Isaiah Brooks. He had not left. He had been watching, waiting. "Sheriff." Isaiah's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority Cutters could never possess. "Territorial law is clear. You cannot force entry on a private lease without a writ. That warrant you signed yourself is not worth the paper it is written on. You are trespassing." The men in the posse shifted, their certainty wavering. They feared the Apache, but they also respected Isaiah Brooks. He was a man who knew the law and had seen real battle. For a moment, a tense legal standoff hung in the air, as thick as the dust. Cutter's face purpled with rage. He was not used to being challenged. "To hell with the law," he snarled. He motioned to Jack Ridge and another man. "Get the door." That was all Abigail needed to see. She slammed the door shut, dropped the bolt, and spun around. "Stay back from the walls," she yelled. She did not wait for a reply. She threw her entire weight against the long iron lever of the main steam release valve. The result was instantaneous and cataclysmic, with a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. A massive cloud of pressurized, scalding steam erupted from the safety pipes on the roof and sides of the pump house. It shot out in a dense, white, billowing fog, instantly engulfing the posse. The night exploded with screams of shock and pain. The men were blinded, disoriented, the superheated vapor stinging their skin and robbing the air of breath. They stumbled back, coughing and cursing, their threats turning into panicked yelps. One of Cutter's men, his vision completely gone, tripped backward and fell with a great splash into the long wooden water trough used to cool the pump machinery. He came up sputtering, soaked and shivering, from the relative safety of the doorway. Mei Lin, who had a small bag of her laundry supplies with her, saw her chance. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed a bar of her strongest lye soap into the trough. "Might as well take a bath," she called out, her voice sharp with derision. "It is free." Through the swirling, dissipating steam, a flash of orange fire bloomed. A gunshot. The bullet tore through the wooden wall of the pump house with a sound like a giant whip crack. Abigail felt a searing, white-hot line of pain trace itself along her earlobe as the lead splintered the wood frame just behind her head. She cried out, stumbling back, her hand flying to her ear, coming away sticky with blood. Seeing her hit, Dasan let out a low growl of fury. He lunged for the door, his knife in his hand, ready to charge into the chaos and meet his enemies head-on. But Abigail grabbed his good arm with all her strength, her fingers digging into his muscle. "No," she gasped, the words ragged. "Live first, then we fight." He stopped, his body trembling with contained violence. He looked from her bleeding ear to the door and then back to her face. He saw the fierce, desperate intelligence in her eyes, the plea for strategy over sacrifice. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod and stepped back from the door. Outside, the confusion was total. Jack Ridge, choking on the steam and panicked by his own gunshot, stumbled away from the building. In his haste, he fumbled at his neck, trying to pull his bandana up over his mouth. The blue cloth slipped from his grasp and fell to the muddy ground near the doorstep. At the same time, as he tried to reload his rifle, a single brass shell casing ejected from the chamber, glinting as it fell beside the bandana. No one saw it happen except Isaiah, while the other men were still rubbing their eyes and helping their comrade from the water trough. Isaiah calmly walked forward, his boots squelching in the mud. He placed his foot over the bandana and the casing, then, in one smooth motion, bent down as if to check his bootlace. When he straightened up, both items were gone, safely tucked into the deep leather of his boot. The fight had gone out of the posse. They were wet, half-scalded, and spooked. Cutter, his face red with humiliation, tried to rally them, but their hearts were not in it. The steam, the invisible weapon they could not fight, had unnerved them more than any gun. "We will be back at dawn." "Boone!" Cutter roared, his voice promising retribution. "And we will burn you out if we have to." He gathered his bedraggled men and retreated into the darkness, leaving behind a churned-up patch of mud and the lingering, metallic smell of hot steam. The moment they were gone, Isaiah was at the door. "We have to move," he said, his voice urgent. "He will be back with more men, and he will not bother with pretending to be lawful next time." Abigail nodded, her ear throbbing. "Where can we go?" "There is a small cave, up in the rocks behind the station," Isaiah said, "fed by a seep spring. It is not much, but it is defensible, and they will not find it in the dark." The decision was made. Dasan went first, his knife drawn, scouting the path. Mei Lin followed, carrying Rose, who had miraculously slept through the entire ordeal. Isaiah came next, his rifle at the ready. Abigail took one last look at her pump house, at the boiler that was its heart and her sanctuary. She grabbed a lantern, a blanket, and the small pouch of Mei Lin's herbs, then followed them out into the night. The cave was small and damp, but it was hidden. A tiny trickle of water ran down one wall, disappearing into a sandy floor. It was a haven. Isaiah took the first watch outside, disappearing into the shadows of the rocks, inside, by the soft, steady glow of the lantern. Mei Lin made a fresh poultice for Dasan's shoulder and tended to the child. Abigail sat on a flat rock, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her feeling shaky and exhausted. Dasan came and sat beside her. The silence in the cave was a living thing, a stark contrast to the chaos of the last hour. He looked at the bloody furrow on her ear. Then his gaze moved to the old, puckered scar on her cheek, illuminated in the lantern light. She saw him looking and turned her face away by reflex, the old shame rising in her throat. He reached out, not with pity, but with a quiet reverence, and gently touched the raised, damaged skin of the scar with his fingertips. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shock through her that had nothing to do with fear. "This is not ugliness," he said, his voice a low murmur. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, she did not flinch away. He held her gaze for a long moment before he spoke again. "A scar is the map of where you won." The word settled into the deepest part of her. No one had ever called her a winner. The world had only ever seen the damage, the ruin. Dasan saw the victory. In the quiet darkness of the cave, surrounded by enemies, a small, fragile crack appeared in the fortress she had built around her heart. Dawn in the cave was a slow, gray affair. The light seeped in, turning the damp rock walls from black to slate. The small band of fugitives was already awake, their counsel held in hushed tones around the guttering lantern. Rose slept soundly, her fever broken. A small, peaceful island in a sea of trouble. Isaiah laid his findings on a flat rock that served as their table. First, the blue bandana, its color a bold slash of defiance against the drab stone. Then, the brass Spencer shell casing, which he had polished clean of mud. It gleamed with a malevolent light. "This proves it was not a traditional raiding party," Isaiah stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the rock itself. "This is Jack Ridge's signature, and this casing matches the rifle he carries." "It is not enough," Abigail said, her mind already working, calculating angles and pressures as if this were a problem of mechanics. "The town is scared. They will believe what Cutter tells them to believe. A piece of cloth and a shell casing are not enough to change their minds. We need more. We need a reason." She paused, her gaze turning inward, her hands automatically wiping themselves on her trousers as if covered in grease. She was back in the pump house, in her small office, going over the weekly water usage ledgers. There was something else. A loose page, tucked into the back of the newest ledger. She had almost missed it. "The railroad," she said, thinking aloud. "A few weeks ago, I found a surveyor's map. It was stuck to the back cover with hide glue. It showed a new proposed spur line, one that would cut south of the main track." She looked up, her eyes locking with Isaiah's. It was routed to bypass Dry Creek entirely. Except for one thing. It ran directly through the aquifer that feeds my well. If that line were built, this station, my station, would be the only reliable water source for 100 miles in either direction. Isaiah nodded slowly, the implications clicking into place. A monopoly. The railroad company would pay a fortune for guaranteed access to that water. "And Cutter gets a cut," Dasan finished. "His English spare, but his meaning sharp. He makes the trouble. He removes you. He sells the land. He gets rich." It was a simple, brutal equation of greed. Now they had the motive, but they still lacked the kind of proof that could sway a mob. They needed a voice the town would listen to, a voice of moral authority. "There is one person," Mei Lin said quietly. "He hears everything, and everyone trusts him, even when they do not like him." "Father O'Rourke," Isaiah confirmed. The Irish priest who had come to Dry Creek to save souls and seemed to spend most of his time despairing of them over a bottle of whiskey. He was a man of contradictions, but his integrity was as solid as the church he had built with his own hands. Isaiah went alone, moving through the pre-dawn light like a shadow. He found the priest not in the church, but sitting on the back steps of the rectory, a steaming mug of what was certainly not just coffee in his hands. Isaiah explained the situation in low, urgent tones. He did not ask the priest to break the seal of the confessional. He simply laid out the facts as they knew them. Father O'Rourke listened, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, fixed on the rising sun. When Isaiah was finished, the priest took a long swallow from his mug. "A man's soul is a tangled thing. Sergeant," he said, his voice raspy, "sometimes a man will confess to a sin but not the crime that surrounds it. He may speak of greed, but not of the stolen goods that feed it." His gaze met Isaiah's. Hank Blubber has a heavy conscience and a loose tongue when he thinks God is the only one listening. He took another drink. "I cannot speak of what was said in confidence, but if a man were to be assured, absolutely assured, that he would be protected from the wrath of those he implicated, well, fear can silence a confession, but the promise of safety can sometimes give it a voice." It was all Isaiah needed. He returned to the cave with a new piece of the puzzle. Hank Blubber, the greasy, opportunistic trader out at Coyote Wash, was their link. He was the fence for the goods the Ridge Boys had stolen, and he was weak. The journey to Coyote Wash was a descent into a harsher, wilder land. They left Rose in the care of Mei Lin, who would watch from a high vantage point, ready to create a diversion if Cutter's men returned to the water station. The four of them, Abigail, Dasan, Isaiah, and another of Dasan's quiet, watchful warriors, traveled light and fast. They moved through a landscape of thorns and rock, following the serpentine path of a dry arroyo. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the sand was a physical force. Dasan moved with an effortless grace, his feet seeming to find purchase where there was none. He showed Abigail how to read the faint trails of snakes and lizards, how to conserve her energy, how to walk in the shadow of a rock outcropping, a trick he called walking on the snake's shadow, to save the water in her body. It was a lesson in survival, taught without lectures, a quiet sharing of knowledge that felt more intimate than any conversation. The desert was not their only enemy. The sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue, suddenly turned a bruised purple. The temperature dropped, and within minutes, they were being pelted by pellets of ice, a hailstorm that struck the hard ground with the sound of 1,000 tiny hammers. They huddled under a rocky overhang, the sudden violent shift in the weather a stark reminder of the land's indifference to their struggle. As the hail subsided, a low roar began to build in the distance. "A flash flood," Dasan said, his voice sharp with urgency. The arroyo. Now. A wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, was racing down the dry riverbed towards them. They scrambled up the sandy banks, but the ground beneath Abigail's feet gave way. She slid back, her boots sinking into a patch of wet, sucking sand that pulled at her like a living thing. Panic seized her, but before she could cry out, Dasan was there. He had grabbed the root of a tough mesquite bush with his good hand and, leaning far out, seized the front of her shirt with the other. His grip was like iron. With a single, powerful heave, he pulled her free of the sand just as the first wave of the floodwaters tore past where she had been standing. He hauled her up the bank and onto solid rock, their bodies colliding, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The roar of the water filled the world. In that moment, pressed against him, feeling the solid strength of his body, she understood that he was not just her protector. He was her partner in this fight. Coyote Wash was less a town and more a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled in the heat, a place where men came to trade things they had no right to own. Hank Blubber's trading post was the largest of these buildings, a squat adobe structure with a sagging porch. They devised a plan. Isaiah and Dasan's warrior would remain out of sight, ready to act as backup. Dasan would circle around to the back, watching and listening. Abigail would go with Mei Lin, who had rejoined them after leaving Rose hidden and safe. The two women, an unlikely pair, would be the spearhead. Mei Lin entered the trading post first, a picture of humble domesticity, a shopping basket on her arm. Abigail followed a moment later, lingering by the barrels of nails and coils of rope, pretending to be just another settler in for supplies. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and greed. Hank Blubber was a large, sweating man with small, darting eyes that seemed incapable of meeting anyone's gaze directly. Mei Lin began to haggle over the price of calico fabric, her voice the perfect blend of deferential and determined. As she spoke, her sharp eyes scanned the shelves behind the counter, shelves laden with a motley collection of goods, canteens, saddles, sacks of flour, and a small, tarnished silver locket hanging from a nail. Mei Lin paused in her negotiations. "That is a pretty little thing," she said, pointing a slender finger at the locket. "My niece would like such a thing." Hank Blubber's composure broke. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "It is just a trinket," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Not for sale." Mei Lin simply raised an eyebrow. "Everything is for sale." "Mr. Blubber." She had seen the faint, tiny letter R engraved on its surface. Abigail knew it was time for the next part of the plan. She stepped forward, her face, usually a source of shame, now a tool. She let the full force of her scarred visage fall upon Hank, knowing it was unsettling. "I need something, too," she said, her voice low and direct. "A music player, the kind with the wax cylinders." This was the signal. Isaiah entered the shop, his duster coat hiding his rifle. He walked to the counter and dropped a heavy coin pouch on it. The sound of the gold echoed in the tense silence. "I hear you can get a man whatever he needs. Blubber," Isaiah said, his voice hard. "I need Spencer ammunition, a whole crate of it, and I need it now." Hank's eyes widened, his greed warring with his fear. A whole crate. That was a lot, too much for him to have on hand. "I might know a man," he stammered. "I would have to send for him." "Do it," Isaiah commanded. Hank scurried to the back of the store. They heard a muffled conversation. A few minutes later, Jack Ridge sauntered in, a confident smirk on his face. The smirk faltered slightly when he saw Abigail and Isaiah. "What is this?" Ridge asked, his hand drifting towards his gun. "Business," Isaiah said smoothly. "I need a supply of Spencer rounds. Hank says you are the man to talk to." While they spoke, Abigail was busy. She had brought with her the guts of a small Edison phonograph, its horn removed, its recording stylus newly sharpened. It was her own invention, a crude but functional recording device, hidden inside a large biscuit tin with a hole punched in the side. She placed it on the counter, positioning the stylus towards the men. With a quiet click, she engaged the mechanism. The wax cylinder began to turn. Ridge, puffed up with importance, began to brag. He spoke of a recent acquisition, a wagon load of goods that had practically fallen into his lap. He laughed as he described how they had used blue bandanas to look like Apache. He even mentioned how the sheriff was pleased with their work, how it was all part of a bigger plan. Every word, every boast, was being etched by the tiny needle into the soft wax. They had it, but just as Ridge was naming his price, his eyes fell upon the biscuit tin. "What is that clicking sound?" he asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He reached for the tin, but Mei Lin was faster. She had been standing near a sack of beans, and with a sudden, loud cry, she tripped, sending a cascade of dried beans scattering across the floor. "My order is ready!" she shouted, as if this were a signal. It was not the one they had planned, but it was better. From her pocket, she produced a bar of soap and, with a powerful underhand toss, sent it skidding across the floorboards right into Ridge's path. Ridge, his attention diverted, stepped right on it. His feet went out from under him, and he crashed to the floor with a howl of surprise and pain. "Now!" Isaiah yelled. Abigail snatched the biscuit tin. Dasan appeared at the back door, creating another point of confusion. The four of them scrambled out into the blinding sunlight, leaving Hank Blubber and Jack Ridge in a tangle of limbs and spilled beans. They leaped onto the mules they had waiting in a nearby gully and spurred them into a gallop, riding out into the red dust of the desert. Clutching a tin box that held not biscuits, but the truth, Dasan led them away from the open desert and into a maze of narrow, winding canyons where the rock walls rose up to touch a sliver of blue sky. The air grew cooler, and the sound of their mules' hooves was muffled by the sand. He brought them to a place that felt hidden from the world, a box canyon with walls of deep azure stone that seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight and gentle it. In the center of the canyon floor, a small pool of water steamed in the cool air, fed by a warm spring that bubbled up from the earth. Canyon Azul. He called it Blue Canyon. It was a place of peace. They made their camp in a shallow cave behind the pool, a natural shelter that offered a clear view of the canyon entrance. Rose, delighted by the warm water, splashed happily in the shallows under Mei Lin's watchful eye, her laughter echoing softly off the blue rocks. For the first time in days, Abigail felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen. Here, they were safe. Here, they could breathe. Later that afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They were Apache. Abigail's hand instinctively went to the biscuit tin containing their precious evidence, but Dasan laid a calming hand on her arm. "It is my father," he said. The lead rider was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long silver hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his age. This was Old Coyote. His eyes, dark and luminous, held a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the rocks around them. He looked at the camp, at the child playing, at the Chinese woman watching her, at the scarred white woman standing beside his son. His gaze lingered on Abigail, but there was no judgment in it, only a deep, quiet seeing. He and Dasan spoke in their own tongue, the words flowing like the water from the spring. The 2 warriors who had come with him began to unpack supplies from their horses' dried meat, blankets, and a small, beaded leather pouch that the old man took with great care. It was his medicine bag. Old Coyote approached Abigail. He did not speak English, but his gestures were a language of their own. He took a pinch of dried herbs from his bag and set them smoldering on a flat rock. A thin, fragrant ribbon of smoke rose into the air. He fanned the smoke towards Abigail with an eagle feather, a silent blessing of cleansing and protection. Then, From around his neck, he removed a simple medallion of beaten silver hanging from a leather cord. He held it out to her. Dasan translated his father's words. He says this is to remind you that the heart sees what the eyes cannot. Abigail accepted the gift, her rough fingers closing around the cool, smooth metal. She looked at the old shaman, at this man whose people her people feared and hated, and felt an acceptance so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. That evening, a small fire cast a warm, flickering glow against the cave wall. Rose was asleep, wrapped in a warm blanket, her face peaceful in the firelight. Maylin and Isaiah were taking turns on watch. Old Coyote sat apart, a silent, watchful presence. Abigail and Dasan sat together near the fire, the silence between them comfortable, charged with the unspoken events of the last few days. It was Dasan who finally broke it. "My wife," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the flames. "She was taken in a removal. Years ago, sent east. I never saw her again. I heard she died of a fever in the winter camps." He fell silent, the loss a palpable thing in the small space. He had never told this to an outsider before. He did not know why he was telling her now, only that it felt right. Abigail listened, her own heart aching with a grief she understood. She knew what it was to have your world consumed by a sudden, violent fire. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his, a simple gesture of shared sorrow. "I was a girl when the oil well caught fire," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was the only one who got out. This," she touched her scarred cheek, "is what the fire left me." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was warm and strong. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt the last of her defenses crumble. He leaned in, and she did not pull away. His embrace was not one of passion, but of profound comfort, a silent promise of shelter. He held her for a long moment, simply held her, and she rested her head against his good shoulder, feeling a sense of rightness she had never known. When he drew back, he gently kissed her forehead, a touch as soft as a prayer. "I will protect you," he murmured, "and I you." She replied, the words a vow. She laughed then, a small, broken sound. "Even with your protection, I'm still a sight to behold, so ugly." Dasan's expression hardened, not with anger at her, but at the world that had taught her to say such a thing. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. He led her over to where old Coyote sat with Rose sleeping nearby. Ridiculed for her ugly face, Dasan's voice was not loud, but it filled the cave, resonating with a fierce, protective pride. "Fools! To me, she is my greatest treasure." Old Coyote looked from his son to the woman standing beside him, her hand in his, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his ancient face. He nodded once, a gesture of profound approval. The moment was a turning point. It was no longer just about survival. It was about building a future. They gathered together, their small council of outcasts, and laid their plans. "We cannot win with violence," Isaiah said, his practical, soldier's mind taking charge. "Cutter has the numbers. We must win with the law." He looked at the biscuit tin that held their wax cylinder. "I will write a formal deposition and send it by wire to the United States Marshal in Prescott. This recording is our proof. It will take him a few days to get here. But when he does, he will come with the full force of federal law behind him." "I will speak with Father O'Rourke again," Abigail added. "If Hank Blubber is to be a witness, he will need the priest to stand with him, to give him the courage to speak the truth in public." Mei Lin, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "There are a dozen Chinese families working on the railroad line maintenance crew. They are good people. They keep to themselves, but they understand injustice. I will speak to them. When the time comes, it will be good to have friendly faces in the crowd, people who will not be swayed by Cutter's lies." Their purpose was clear. They would not become the monsters they were fighting. They would not seek revenge. They would seek justice, out in the open, for the entire town to see. The tension of the moment was broken by a small voice. "Is treasure something you can eat?" Rose was awake, rubbing her eyes, looking from Dasan to Abigail. Dasan smiled, a rare, brilliant flash of warmth. "Yes," he said, his eyes twinkling as he looked at Abigail. "When it cooks beans." Abigail playfully nudged him with her elbow. "This treasure has rules," she said, her tone light and teasing. "You have to clean the pot after the beans are gone." Rose giggled, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that for a moment made the world outside the canyon disappear. In that small, firelit cave, they were not fugitives. They were a family. The peace was shattered late that night when one of Dasan's warriors slipped silently back into camp. He had been scouting the hills around Dry Creek. His report was grim. Cutter had not been idle. He had ridden to the outlying ranches, spreading his poison. He was telling everyone that the savage Apache king had stolen a white child and was holding her hostage, aided by the disfigured woman at the water station. Fear was a powerful tool, and Cutter was using it to forge a weapon. He had gathered a posse of more than 20 men, armed and angry, ready to follow him. He was telling them he was going to rescue the child. He was planning to attack the canyon at first light. The brief moment of hope in Canyon Azul was over. The storm they had been preparing for was no longer days away. It was coming with the dawn. The news of Cutter's impending attack settled over the small cave like a shroud. The flickering firelight danced on grim, determined faces. They were out of time, and a direct fight in the canyon would be a slaughter. They had one weapon left, but it was not a gun. It was the truth, captured on a fragile cylinder of wax. "We cannot fight them on their terms," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the heavy silence. "If we hide here and they attack, we are just savages in a cave. Exactly what Cutter wants everyone to believe. We have to change the battlefield." Isaiah looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his weary eyes. "You want to bring the fight to him?" "Not to him," Abigail corrected. "To the town. We have to make them see. We need to turn his lie inside out, in front of everyone." The plan she laid out was audacious, a gamble that staked their lives on the fragile conscience of a frightened town. They would not wait for Cutter's attack. They would preempt it. They would force his hand, making him act not in the shadowy wilderness, but in the open, dusty expanse of the town square, under the unforgiving light of the sun and the eyes of his neighbors. The bait, she explained, would be the very thing he was pretending to rescue. Father O'Rourke, summoned by a prearranged signal from Maylin, arrived before the moon had set. He listened to the plan, his face grim, and took a long pull from a silver flask. "It is madness," he declared, "but it is a righteous madness. God help us, I will do it." And so, as the first pale light of dawn touched the high canyon walls, the strange procession began. Father O'Rourke's black buggy, a familiar sight in Dry Creek, carried Isaiah on the driver's seat. Beside him, huddled under a thick blanket, was Maylin, and nestled safely in her lap. Clutching the silver locket that had been returned to her, was Rose. In the back of the buggy, hidden beneath a pile of canvas sacks, was Abigail and her precious biscuit tin. Dasan and his 2 warriors did not ride with them. They moved on foot, slipping through the rocks like ghosts, taking a high path along the ridges that would bring them unseen to the rooftops of the town. Old Coyote remained behind in Canyon Azul. He would keep a small, smoky fire burning, a decoy to make any of Cutter's scouts believe they were still hunkered down, waiting for the end. The journey to town was a long, slow torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifleman. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of an approaching posse. Abigail, cramped in the back of the buggy, held the recording device to her chest, protecting it as if it were her own heart. This wax cylinder was their only voice. They entered Dry Creek as the town was just beginning to stir. The buggy did not stop at the church or the water station. It rolled directly into the center of the square, a wide, barren patch of ground between the saloon and the sheriff's office, and stopped beside the public hand pump. Isaiah helped Mei Lin and Rose down. They stood beside the buggy, a small, defiant island in the empty square. Abigail remained hidden. The trap was set. It did not take long for word to spread. A boy who had been sweeping the saloon porch saw them and ran. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The sight of the Chinese woman and the buffalo soldier standing guard over the little girl was a strange and potent mystery. Within minutes, a crowd began to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Then came the thunder. Sheriff Cutter and his posse rode into town, not as a disciplined force of lawmen, but as a mob, their faces flushed with righteous anger. Jack Ridge was at Cutter's side, a cruel smirk on his face. Prudence Vale was not with them. She was already in the square, her arms crossed, her expression one of vindicated fury. "Look!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crowd. "They have brought the poor child out to taunt us. They are flaunting their wickedness." Cutter dismounted, playing his role to the hilt. He strode forward, his chest puffed out, a savior in a dusty coat. "All right," he boomed, addressing Isaiah. "You have had your fun. Hand over the girl. I will see you are not harmed." Isaiah stood his ground, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he held loosely at his side. "The girl is safe, Sheriff," which is more than can be said for that supply wagon up in the pass. The crowd stirred, confused. This was not the simple story of rescue they had been told. From behind Cutter, Prudence's voice rose again, sharp and venomous. "Do not listen to him. He is in league with the Apache king. Hang them all. Hang the savage and his accomplices." The word hang rippled through the crowd, an ugly, dangerous sound. Some men shouted in agreement, their fear turning to rage. Others looked on, their faces uncertain, caught between Cutter's authority and Isaiah's quiet defiance. The town square had become a powder keg, and Prudence Vale was holding a lit match. This was Abigail's cue. She pushed aside the canvas sacks and stood up in the back of the buggy. A collective gasp went through the crowd as they saw her scarred face. Before Cutter or anyone else could react, she lifted the biscuit tin and placed it on the platform of the town water pump. She opened the lid, revealing the strange contraption inside. With a steady hand, she placed the needle on the wax cylinder and cranked the handle. A strange, tinny, scratching sound filled the air. Then, a voice. It was Jack Ridge's voice, reedy and distorted, but unmistakably his, echoing across the silent square. "A wagon load of goods that had practically fallen into my lap. We used the blue bandanas to look like Apache the sheriff was pleased part of a bigger plan." The effect was stunning. The crowd fell utterly silent, their face turning from the buggy to Jack Ridge, who had gone pale as a ghost. They had all heard it, the plan, the lie, the blue bandanas. "It is a trick," Cutter sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Some kind of devilry." Jack Ridge, his bravado gone, his eyes wide with panic, did the worst thing he could have done. He drew his revolver. He never had the chance to aim it. From the roof of the general store, a rifle cracked, the sound sharp and clean. Ridge's hat flew from his head as if kicked by an invisible foot. It landed in the dust, and lying beside it, for all the world to see, was a folded blue bandana. Ridge froze, his hand holding the useless gun, his bald head gleaming in the sun. The crowd stared, first at the bandana, then at Ridge's face, and in that moment, the entire narrative that Cutter had so carefully constructed fell to pieces. The Ridge boys, seeing their leader exposed, reacted with the brutish instinct of cornered animals. They started shooting. Panic erupted in the square. People screamed and ran for cover, turning the scene into a maelstrom of chaos and fear. Isaiah reacted instantly, not firing into the crowd, but aiming low. His shot took out the front wheel of a freight wagon, which collapsed with a splintering crash, creating a barricade that shielded many of the fleeing townsfolk. From the other side of the square, Mei Lin, who had anticipated this, opened a small cloth bag she carried and threw a cloud of fine white lime powder into the face of a charging thug, who screamed and clawed at his blinded eyes, as if summoned by the violence. The wind picked up, a sudden, powerful gust that whipped the dust of the square into a blinding, choking cloud. The church bell began to swing wildly in the wind, its frantic, clanging toll adding to the pandemonium. Horses screamed and reared, adding to the confusion. In the heart of the swirling chaos, Sheriff Cutter made his last, most desperate move. He lunged for the one thing that could still protect him. He grabbed Rose, pulling the terrified child in front of him as a shield. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "Stay back, or the girl gets it!" The shooting stopped. The Ridge boys, seeing their employer's cowardice, hesitated. The townsfolk, peering from behind cover, watched in horror. Abigail stepped down from the buggy. She began to walk towards Cutter, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze locked on his. She did not have a weapon. She did not need one. "Let her go! Cutter!" she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the wind. "You have lost! Are you so afraid of the truth that you have to hide behind a child?" Her words struck a chord with the crowd. They had seen the proof. They had heard the confession. Now they saw the sheriff of Dry Creek, the man sworn to protect them, cowering behind a little girl. A murmur of disgust and shame ran through them. Just as Cutter's resolve began to crumble, a new sound cut through the chaos. The thunder of hoofbeats, fast and steady. A lone rider was coming, riding hard into town. He was a big man with a long coat and a grim, determined face. A silver star was pinned to his chest. United States Marshal James McBride, alerted by Isaiah's frantic telegraph message, had arrived. He took in the scene at a glance, the panicked sheriff holding a child, the armed thugs, the terrified townsfolk, Isaiah standing behind a broken wagon, his rifle at the ready. "Drop your weapons," McBride's voice boomed with an authority that dwarfed Cutter's. "This is federal business now." Cutter saw his world ending, with a final, desperate snarl. He shoved Rose away from him and raised his pistol, not at the marshal, but at Abigail, the woman who had brought him down. A shot rang out, but it was not from Cutter's gun. From the rooftop. Dasan had seen the move. He did not hesitate. He moved from his concealed position, placing himself directly in the line of fire. Cutter's bullet, meant for Abigail, slammed into Dasan's shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered but did not fall, his body a shield, his debt repaid. Before Cutter could fire again, Marshal McBride's pistol was in his hand, and the heavy barrel laid Cutter out cold on the dusty ground. The siege of Water Station No. 3 was over. The battle for Dry Creek had been won. The dust in the town square of Dry Creek began to settle, clinging to clothes and coating tongues with a gritty film of the day's violence. The silence that followed the final gunshot was more profound than any noise. It was a vacuum, filled with the stunned, blinking disbelief of a people who had just watched their world turn upside down. Marshal James McBride stood over the unconscious form of Eli Cutter, his face a mask of grim efficiency. The star on his chest seemed to be the only thing in the square that still held a true, steady light. With a jerk of his head, he motioned to a couple of the braver townsmen. "Get these so-called deputies disarmed. All of them." His voice was the hard, flat sound of undisputed authority. The Ridge boys, deprived of their leader and their bluster, offered no resistance. They dropped their guns with a clatter, their brief reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. Jack Ridge, however, was a different story. When the marshal hauled him to his feet, the man's bravado dissolved into a puddle of pure, sniveling fear. His panicked eyes darted around at the silent, accusing faces of the crowd. "It was not my idea," he blurted, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, pathetic rush. "It was Cutter, all of it. He paid us to hit that wagon. Said we had to make it look like Apache. He wanted the woman, Boone. Run off her land so he could sell the water rights to the railroad. He said it would make us all rich." The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the dusty air, a final, damning epitaph for the lie that had almost torn the town apart. Marshal McBride listened without expression, then produced a pair of iron handcuffs and locked them around Ridge's wrists. Eli Cutter was just beginning to stir when the marshal hauled him up as well. The disgraced sheriff looked around, his mind still clouded, until he saw the star, the hostile faces, and the bound hands of his chief lieutenant. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. "This is an outrage," he began, his voice a weak imitation of its former boom. "I am the law in this town." "Not anymore," McBride said, clamping the second pair of cuffs onto Cutter's wrists. The click of the metal was a sound of absolute finality. "It is a breakdown of all decency," shrieked Prudence Vale, who had watched the entire scene from the porch of the general store, her face a mask of fury. "This is what happens when you let outsiders and savages dictate our affairs. We must have order." Father O'Rourke, who had made his way to the marshal's side, turned his weary, whiskey-sore eyes on her. "Order, Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice cold and clear, "does not exist to conceal sin. It exists to serve justice. I suggest you go home and pray you can tell the difference." Prudence stared at him, speechless for the first time in her life, and for once she had no reply. In the midst of the official proceedings, Abigail's world had shrunk to a single point of focus. Dasan. He was leaning against the shattered wagon wheel, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He had taken the bullet meant for her. He was conscious, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were clear when they found hers. Abigail went to him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Maylin was already there, pressing a clean strip of cloth against the wound to stanch the bleeding. "We must get this bullet out," Maylin said, her voice tight with urgency, "and the wound must be cleaned and stitched." The marshal, seeing the situation, directed them to the rectory. "The priest's house will do. It is neutral ground." In the sparse, clean light of Father O'Rourke's study, they laid Dasan on a long wooden table. The bullet had gone through the thick muscle of his shoulder, a ragged, ugly wound, while Mei Lin boiled water and prepared her herbal remedies. Abigail looked at the damage, her mechanic's mind assessing the problem. She needed a needle and thread, but not the delicate kind used for sewing shirts. She needed something strong, something that could pull torn flesh together. Without a word, she left the rectory and ran, not to the general store, but to the small, forgotten corner of the livery stable where she kept a spare toolkit. She returned with a fine, curved upholstery needle used for repairing leather seats, and a spool of waxed linen thread, the kind used for stitching drive belts. They were tools of her trade, designed for strength and durability. Her hands trembled as she threaded the needle. These hands that could calibrate a steam valve to 1/1000th of an inch or break loose a rusted bolt felt clumsy and foreign. She took a deep breath, the scent of the priest's old books and Mei Lin's herbs filling her senses, and steadied herself. Dasan watched her, his expression a mixture of pain and trust. "Do not leave a scar," he said, a faint, teasing smile touching his lips. Abigail met his gaze, a responding smile finding its way through her fear. "I like scars," she said softly, echoing his own words back to him. "They are the map of where you won." Her first stitch was hesitant, but the second was firm. Her hands, remembering the familiar feel of making repairs, grew steady. She worked with a focused, methodical grace. Her world narrowed to this single, vital task, mending the man who had shielded her. Outside, the town was beginning a slow, awkward reckoning with itself. As the marshal led Cutter and his men to be locked in the jail cells, some of the townsfolk approached Abigail's small group of allies. A few men mumbled apologies to Isaiah, their eyes downcast. One woman, who had been vocal in her support of Prudence, brought a small jar of broth to Mei Lin, a silent offering of peace. A young man, Billy Hart, who worked as a general hand at the livery, shuffled forward, his hat clutched in his hands. He approached Abigail as she stood on the rectory porch, taking a breath of fresh air. "Ma'am," he said, his face beet red, I picked this up in the confusion." He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was the blue bandana that had fallen from Jack Ridge's head. He had seen the truth and, in his own small way, had secured it. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning, a sign that the fear that had held Dry Creek in its grip was starting to break. "Thank you, Billy," Abigail said, taking the bandana. That was a brave thing to do. The boy looked up, a flicker of pride in his eyes, before he mumbled a goodbye and hurried away. Later that day, Marshal McBride posted a notice on the sheriff's office door. It declared that the town of Dry Creek was, until a new sheriff could be appointed by the territorial governor, under federal jurisdiction. It also announced a formal investigation into the business practices of the railroad company concerning land and water rights in the region. And in a final, stunning declaration, it placed the water station number 3 and the small band of Chiricahua led by the man known as Dasan under the temporary protection of the United States government as material witnesses in a federal case. For the first time, they were not fugitives. They were protected. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Abigail stood on the porch, watching the town slowly find its new rhythm. She saw Isaiah talking with the marshal, the two men, soldiers from different worlds, finding a common language in the law. She saw Mei Lin, who had brought a basket of food from her own meager pantry, sharing it with Rose and a few of the other town children who now approached the little girl not with fear, but with shy curiosity. She looked at this collection of people who had risked everything for each other: the Apache warrior, the black soldier, the Chinese laundress, the Irish priest, and the scarred mechanic. They were a strange and motley crew, bound by no ties of blood or nation, but by a shared belief in what was right. She realized, with a clarity that was both startling and comforting, that this was family, a family you chose, a family you forged in the fire. Her gaze drifted to the edge of town, where a small group of riders had appeared. It was Old Coyote and his warriors. They sat on their horses, still and watchful, waiting. Dasan, his arm now in a sling, his face pale but his eyes clear, came to stand beside her on the porch. He saw his father, and across the distance, the two men exchanged a silent nod. It was a look of deep, unspoken understanding, a confirmation that their people had survived, that their story would continue. Old Coyote dismounted and walked towards them. He did not go to his son. He came directly to Abigail. From a pouch at his belt, he took a small object and pressed it into her hand. It was a ring, a simple band of silver inlaid with a single, perfect piece of turquoise, the color of the Arizona sky on a clear day. He spoke in his own language, his voice soft. Dasan translated. He says, "This is to keep the promise. A promise made is a stone thrown in a deep pool. The ripples spread, and the water is never the same." Abigail looked from the ring to Dasan, her heart full. Dasan did not take her hand or make a grand declaration. He simply met her eyes, a deep and steady warmth in his gaze. "When the law is quiet," he said, "when justice is done, then we will talk of promises." She understood. It was not a hesitation, but a testament, a promise that their future would be built not in the chaos of a fight, but in the quiet strength of a hard-won peace. That evening, the small group gathered on the rectory porch. The air was cool and clean. The dust finally settled. Mei Lin opened a jar of preserved apricots, the fruit glowing like amber in the lantern light. "Eat," she said, offering the jar around. "They are sour at first, like life, but sweet afterwards." Isaiah took one, stroking his thick mustache thoughtfully. "And they stick in your beard," he rumbled, a twinkle in his eye. "Just like the law," And for the first time in a long time, in the quiet heart of Dry Creek, they all laughed. The chaos of the day bled into a night of profound, almost unnatural stillness. The town of Dry Creek held its breath, the violence and revelations having scoured the air clean of its usual bluster. At the rectory, a quiet watch was kept. Marshal McBride had posted a deputy outside, but the real guards were the bonds of loyalty that had been forged in the crucible of the last few days. Inside, the silence was different. It was heavy with exhaustion and unspoken grief. Old Coyote had weakened. The long ride, the tension, the final. Vicarious battle had taken a toll on his aged body. He lay on a simple cot in Father O'Rourke's study, his breathing as soft and shallow as the rustle of dry leaves. Dasan sat beside him, a stoic, silent vigil. Abigail brought a cool cloth for the old man's brow, her movements gentle. Old Coyote's eyes, still luminous, opened and found hers. He beckoned her closer. With a trembling hand, he untied the small, beaded medicine bag from his neck. It was a beautiful thing, worn smooth with age and reverence, humming with a quiet power. He pressed it into her hand, his fingers dry and cool like river stones. He began to speak, his voice a faint whisper, the words in his own tongue. Dasan translated, his own voice thick with emotion. He says the story is the life of the people. When one generation weakens, the next must carry it. He says the vessel must be strong. Old Coyote's gaze did not leave Abigail's face. His eyes were not on her scar. They seemed to look past it, into the very heart of her. He gave the faintest of smiles, a slight crinkling at the corners of his eyes. And then his gaze shifted to his son. He spoke again, a few soft words. Carry the story, my son. Let it live. Then, with a final, gentle sigh, his eyes closed. His spirit slipped away from the small room as quietly and naturally as the setting of the moon. The dawn that followed was gray and somber. They buried him on a small, wind-swept hill just outside of town, a place dotted with the stark, proud shapes of yucca plants. It was a simple ceremony, an island of ancient tradition in a new and hostile land. Dasan placed an eagle feather on his father's chest, a guide for his spirit on its journey. Abigail, holding the medicine bag tight in her hand, sprinkled a handful of cornmeal onto the grave, an offering of sustenance for the road ahead. Mei Lin, Isaiah, and Rose stood with them, their small, strange family united in grief. As they stood in silent farewell, a lone figure approached from the town. It was Pastor Allen, the town's preacher, a man Abigail had only ever seen from a distance. He was a stern man, his sermons full of fire and brimstone. But he came now not with judgment, but with a quiet respect. He removed his hat and stood with them for a long moment, his head bowed, a silent acknowledgement that a great man had passed, regardless of the God he prayed to. His presence was a small but profound gesture, a bridge being built over the chasm of fear and mistrust. After the pastor had gone, and they were alone again on the hill, Abigail stood looking out over the desert. The turquoise ring old Coyote had given her was on her finger, a cool, solid weight. "It is a strange thing," she said, her voice soft. "All my life, I have felt their eyes on my face, watching me, judging me, but his eyes," she touched her scarred cheek. "I never felt ugly when he looked at me. It was like he could not see it." Dasan came to stand beside her. "He saw you," he said, his voice a low, steady comfort. "He saw the strong vessel, the heart that sees what the eyes cannot. He saw the same thing I see." The town they returned to was not the same one they had left. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was joined now by a new and fragile sense of shame and a flicker of hope. Marshal McBride's notice about the appointment of a new sheriff was the talk of the town. For the first time, the people of Dry Creek were being asked to take responsibility for their own law, not just to blindly follow the man with the biggest gun. Prudence Vale had retreated into her boarding house, her window curtains drawn, her reign as the town's moral arbiter broken. In her place, a new voice of conscience was emerging. Father O'Rourke, sobered by the recent events, had called a meeting. He spoke not of sin, but of community. He proposed that they use the funds from the church collection not to build a taller steeple, but to start a small school. A school, he declared, for all the children of Dry Creek, a place where they could learn to read the law for themselves. That afternoon, the sky, which had been a harsh, brassy blue for weeks, began to fill with clouds. A gentle, steady rain began to fall. It was a rare and precious thing in that arid land. It washed the layers of red dust from the roofs and storefronts, turning the packed earth of the streets from a pale, angry brown to a dark, rich umber. The air filled with the clean, sharp scent of wet creosote and damp earth. It was a baptism, a cleansing. The ground, long starved for moisture, drank deeply, and in the softened earth, the dormant seeds of wildflowers began to stir, promising a future bloom. But the past was not yet buried. A rider from one of the outlying ranches brought news. 2 of the Ridge boys, men who had escaped the marshal's roundup, had been spotted. They were holed up in a canyon a few miles east, armed and desperate. A hard, cold light entered Dasan's eyes. The warrior's instinct, honed by years of survival, took over. "They are a snake left in the rocks," he said, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "A snake will always bite. I will hunt them." "No," Abigail said, her voice firm. She stepped in front of him, placing a hand on his chest. He stopped, looking down at her, surprised by her intensity. She met his gaze, her own eyes pleading. "We cannot," she said. "If we do that, we become them. We just continue the story of violence, the story they started. We have to write a new one." "But they are a threat," he argued. "To you, to all of us. We have the marshal, we have the law. That is our weapon now. We change the story by doing what is right, Dasan, not by repeating what is wrong. We build a house with a solid foundation so the snakes cannot get in. We do not spend the rest of our lives hunting them in the desert." He looked at her for a long moment, a battle of instincts raging within him. He saw the wisdom in her words, the promise of a different kind of future, a future built not on revenge, but on justice. He slowly relaxed, his hand falling away from his knife. He covered her hand with his own. "You are right," he said, "a new story." His decision was validated later that day. Marshal McBride sought him out. "Dasan," he said, getting straight to the point, "I am leading a team of surveyors and investigators into these hills to look into the railroad's dealings. I need a guide, someone who knows this land, someone who can keep my men safe. It is a federal post. It pays a wage, and it comes with protection for you and your people." It was more than a job. It was a bridge, a legitimate, protected place in the world that Cutter had tried to deny them. It was a way for Dasan to use his skills not just to survive, but to build, to protect his people under the shield of the very law they had fought to uphold. He accepted. That evening, the small family gathered once more on the rectory porch, the gentle rain still whispering on the roof. Rose, who now followed Abigail everywhere, came and leaned against her knee, looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Can I call you Auntie Abigail?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Abigail's heart seemed to swell in her chest. "Of course you can," she said, stroking the child's soft hair. Mei Lin, who was mending a tear in one of Rose's dresses, looked up, a bright, mischievous twinkle in her eyes. "Of course," she said, "Auntie Ugly is the prettiest woman in this whole territory." And Abigail Boone laughed. It was not the small, wry sound she was used to, the one that always pulled at her scar and felt tight in her throat. This was a full, open sound, a sound free of pain and memory, the sound of a treasure that had finally been brought into the light. A week later, the sun rose on a day of judgment in Dry Creek. It was not a judgment of fire and brimstone, but of paper and testimony. Marshal James McBride had transformed the town square into an open-air courtroom. A long trestle table served as the bench, and the public water pump, the very symbol of the conflict, stood like a silent witness. The entire town was there. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of apprehension, shame, and a fierce, undeniable curiosity. They had been fed a diet of fear and lies for so long, and now they were hungry for the truth, no matter how bitter it might taste. McBride, his face set like carved granite, stood and let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. He unrolled a scroll of paper and began to read the charges against Eli Cutter and Jack Ridge, who stood under guard, their hands bound, their faces sullen and defeated. The words rang out in the clear morning air: conspiracy, attempted murder, theft of federal property, inciting a riot. Each charge was a hammer blow, dismantling the last vestiges of the authority these men had once held. When he was finished, he looked to Abigail. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice respectful, "please, tell the court what you found." Abigail walked forward, the surveyor's map clutched in her hand, her heart hammered against her ribs, but her step was steady. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer ugly Abigail. She was a witness. She spread the map on the table, its lines and figures a foreign language to most of the onlookers. But Abigail spoke the language of machines and measurements, and she made them understand. She pointed with a steady finger, her voice clear and strong. "This is the official railroad survey map, and this," she laid a smaller, cruder drawing beside it. "This is the map I found hidden in my ledger. See here, the new spur line. It is drawn to bypass the town, but it cuts directly across the deep aquifer. My well is the only one that taps it. This station was to become a private toll booth for the railroad's water. Cutter and Ridge were not just trying to drive me out. They were trying to steal the water from every one of you." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. They understood this. Water was life. It was a language everyone in the territory spoke fluently. Isaiah Brooks was next. He stood tall and straight, his testimony delivered with the clipped precision of a military report. He presented the blue bandana and the Spencer shell casing, laying them on the table as evidence. He spoke of the tracks, of Cutter's illegal warrant, of the ambush at the water station. He did not embellish or speculate. He simply presented the facts, and their weight was undeniable. Maylin followed him. She spoke softly, yet her voice carried to every corner of the square. She told of seeing the silver locket on Hank Blubber's shelf, the locket that now hung safely around Rose's neck. She described the fear in the trader's eyes, the panicked arrival of Jack Ridge. Her testimony was a delicate, intricate brushstroke that painted a vivid picture of guilt. Finally, Father O'Rourke stepped forward. He had not touched a drop of whiskey all morning. His eyes were clear, and his voice, though raspy, was filled with a moral fire. He spoke of the poison of greed, of a confession of a heavy conscience he had heard, and of his own failure to speak out sooner. He looked out at the faces of his flock. A town is not a collection of buildings. He said, "It is a covenant, a promise we make to one another to be decent, to be just. We have broken that covenant. Today is the day we begin to mend it." The case was overwhelming. The truth was laid bare for all to see. Cutter and Ridge stood exposed, their lies stripped away, their greed a naked, ugly thing. It was then that the last, desperate spasm of the old evil made itself known. A sharp crack echoed from the bell tower of the church, and the wood of the table beside Abigail's hand exploded into splinters. A second shot followed almost instantly. The crowd screamed, a wave of panic undoing the fragile peace. People dove for cover, the square once again dissolving into chaos. Dasan, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd with his warriors, a silent, watchful presence, moved with the speed of a striking hawk. He had seen the puff of smoke from the belfry an instant before the first shot. He was not running for cover. He was running towards Abigail. just as she looked up, confused, towards the sound. He crashed into her, his good shoulder driving her to the ground behind the solid iron base of the water pump. A third bullet whistled through the air where her head had been a second before. Isaiah's reaction was just as swift. He raised his rifle, not to fire wildly, but with a soldier's discipline. He identified the source of the attack, the louvered windows of the belfry. He fired a single, carefully aimed shot. It was not a killing shot. It was a warning. The bullet ripped through the wooden louvers, sending a shower of splinters into the dark space within. What happened next was the true miracle of Dry Creek. The crowd did not devolve into a mindless mob. Spurred by the courage they had witnessed, a group of townsmen, with young Billy Hart at the forefront, acted. They did not run away. They ran towards the danger. They swarmed the church, their fear burned away by a righteous anger. There was a brief, muffled struggle, and then the two snipers, the last of the Ridge boys, were dragged out into the square, their hands bound, their faces a mask of shocked defeat. They had expected to create chaos. Instead, they had forged a community. The danger was over. The crowd slowly rose, shaken but resolute. The final act of violence had not broken them. It had solidified them. But as the dust settled, the old ugliness lingered in a few dark corners. A woman whispered to her neighbor, loud enough to be heard, "What is a man like that doing with a woman who looks like that?" A few cruel snickers followed. The poison of prejudice was harder to kill than an armed man. Dasan heard it. Abigail heard it. And the old, familiar shame made her want to shrink, to disappear. But Dasan would not allow it. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, and pulled her to her feet. He led her into the very center of the silent square, forcing everyone to look. He stood tall, his wounded shoulder a badge of honor, and his voice, when he spoke, was a thing of pure, ringing power. "Ridiculed for her ugly face," he began, his words sharp and clear until an Apache king declared, "She's my greatest treasure." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the title the town had given him in mockery become a weapon for the truth. "If you need a title to make you listen," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, "then call me a king. But this treasure is the woman who saved your town. This treasure is the one who was brave enough to open her door when all of you had closed your hearts." A profound silence fell over the square. The whispers died. The snickers choked in their throats. The truth of his words, combined with the sheer, unapologetic force of his love, was a blow that shattered the last remnants of their casual cruelty. Several of the townswomen, their faces full of a new understanding, stepped forward and laid a gentle hand on Abigail's shoulder. Across the square, Prudence Vale, who had been watching from her window, quietly lowered her curtain and disappeared from view. Abigail looked up at Dasan, her heart too full for words. She then turned to the crowd, to the women whose hands rested on her, to the men whose faces were now filled with respect. "I only opened the door," she said, her voice soft but steady, free of any pretense. "The rest of us, we did this together." That afternoon, the newly formed town council held its first meeting. Their first official act was to pass a bylaw declaring the well at Water Station Number 3 a public resource, to be managed for the good of all. The next day, a small, hand-painted sign was nailed to the front of the pump house. It read, simply, "Water for all." As the sun began to set that evening, casting the red rocks in a fiery glow, Dasan found Abigail on the porch of the pump house. It was her space, a place of grease and steam and honest work. It was home. He did not kneel. He did not make a flowery speech. He simply took her hand and gently slid the turquoise ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I cannot promise wealth," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "I can only promise to stand beside you." Abigail looked from his earnest face to the ring on her hand, a circle of sky and silver. She felt the medicine bag. which she now wore under her shirt, resting against her heart. She was whole. "Enough," she whispered. She rose on her toes and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of dust and tears and a future as wide and open as the desert sky. They were interrupted by a loud clearing of a throat. Isaiah and Mei Lin stood at the bottom of the porch steps, their faces wreathed in smiles. "I suggest you sign the new water charter into law," Isaiah rumbled, a twinkle in his eye, "before you get to any more of that kissing business." Mei Lin laughed, a sound like small, clear bells. "Do not listen to him," she said. "The signature will be much prettier after the kiss." A few months passed, and the desert, cleansed by the rare and blessed rain, underwent a quiet transformation. The season turned, and the land, which had been a study in red rock and pale dust, was suddenly awash in a riot of improbable color. A miraculous carpet of wildflowers bloomed across the plains and up the sides of the yucca-studded hills, their blues, purples, and yellows, a testament to the life that always waits, patient and resilient, beneath the hardest of surfaces. On the hill where they had laid old Coyote to rest, the flowers were thickest. Abigail often walked there in the cool of the morning, the silence of the place a comforting presence. The grave was marked by a simple pile of stones, but the life erupting all around it was a more fitting monument. This morning, she brought a small, special offering. It was a small, perfectly machined brass gear from the inner workings of a pressure clock, into its surface, with the fine tip of a metal scribe. She had carefully etched 2 words stories live. She placed it among the stones, a piece of her world given to his, a promise that his legacy of wisdom and peace would not be forgotten. The town of Dry Creek was blooming, too, in its own slow, cautious way. The chosen family, the strange collection of outcasts who had stared down a mob, had become the quiet, steady heart of the community. Dasan, in his new role as a federal guide, had found a profound sense of purpose. He led Marshal McBride's men through the treacherous backcountry, his knowledge of the land an invaluable asset in the ongoing investigation into the railroad's corruption. His work gave him a wage, a legal standing, and, most importantly, a shield of federal protection for his people, who had now made a permanent, peaceful camp in the hidden sanctuary of Canyon Azul. Abigail remained at her post, but her role had changed. She was no longer just the keeper of the water. She was its steward. The pump house was still a place of grease and steam, but it was also now a community hub, a place where ranchers came to fill their barrels and exchange news, their interactions with her now marked by a quiet, sometimes awkward, but genuine respect. Her small workshop had expanded, and young Billy Hart, who had returned the blue bandana, was now her eager, if sometimes clumsy, apprentice. Rose, the little girl who had been the catalyst for so much turmoil, was thriving. She was one of the first students to enroll in the new schoolhouse, a small adobe building funded by Father O'Rourke's impassioned pleas and the town's newfound sense of shared responsibility. She was a bright, happy child, her laughter a constant, joyful sound in the once silent rectory gardens where she now lived under the priest's gentle care. And Mei Lin, whose quiet strength had been a bedrock, had found a new, more public voice. With the help of some of the railroad families she had organized, she had started a small lending library and reading fund. She had a firm belief that ignorance was the soil in which fear grew, and she was determined to plant a different kind of garden in Dry Creek, one of knowledge and understanding. Justice, once a foreign concept in the town, had become a real and tangible thing. Eli Cutter and Jack Ridge had been tried, convicted, and sent to the territorial prison in Yuma. The new town charter, guaranteeing public access to the water, was framed and hung not only in the town hall, but in the church and, most surprisingly, in Saguaro Jack's saloon, a constant public reminder of the covenant they had made with each other. The old conflicts had not vanished entirely. Prejudice, Abigail knew, was a deep and stubborn root. There were still whispers in the shadows, still a few hard, resentful stares from those who clung to the old ways, but the whispers were quieter now, and they were drowned out by the growing chorus of friendly greetings. A grudging silence had been replaced by a tipped hat, an averted gaze by a direct nod of respect. Pastor Allen's sermons had changed, too. He spoke less of damnation and more of decency, his favorite scripture now being the one that admonished the faithful to love their neighbors not just in word, but in deed. The town was healing, one small, decent act at a time. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, Abigail and Dasan rode out to Canyon Azul. The place was a sanctuary, filled with the soft murmur of the warm spring and the scent of sage. They sat together on a high ledge overlooking the canyon floor, the world spread out before them. "They will need us to go to Denver soon," Abigail said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The grand jury hearings for the railroad executives. Marshal McBride says our testimony is crucial." Dasan nodded, his gaze on the distant mountains. "We will go," he said. "We will finish the story." He fell silent for a moment. Then a slow smile touched his lips. "And when we come back," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, hopeful energy, "I have an idea. My people have always bred the strongest ponies. Horses that can live on this land, and the Mustangs that run wild here have fire and spirit. I think, together, we could raise a new kind of horse, strong and smart, a horse that belongs to both our worlds." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. A horse that belongs to both worlds. It sounded like a description of the life they were building together. She looked at his strong, handsome profile, at the quiet intelligence in his eyes, and felt a wave of love so powerful it almost took her breath away. He turned to her, and in the soft, fading light, he gently pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture more intimate than any kiss, a silent sharing of thoughts, of dreams, of a future that was no longer a desperate hope, but a tangible thing they were building with their own hands. The next morning, back at the water station, Abigail began her daily ritual. The great steam engine was humming, its rhythmic thumping the steady heartbeat of her world. It was time to open the main valve that sent the precious water flowing into the holding tank for the next train. As she reached for the large iron wheel, her hand brushed against the medicine bag she wore on a cord around her neck, tucked safely beneath her shirt. She paused, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn beads. It was a simple, unconscious gesture, but in it, the entire circle of her story was complete. It had all started with the simple act of opening a door to a stranger in a storm. That act of compassion had led her to open the water for a whole community, freeing them from the grip of a tyrant. And those two acts, of opening a door and opening the water, had given her the courage to do the hardest thing of all, to open her heart. She looked down at her hands, at the faint, silvery lines of old burns that crisscrossed her knuckles, at the new, healthy pink of the bullet graze on her earlobe, at the beautiful turquoise ring that graced her finger. She thought of the puckered, disfigured skin on her cheek. A scar was not a mark of ugliness. She knew that now, with a certainty that was as deep and unshakable as the aquifer beneath her feet. It was a story etched in skin, a testament. It was the map that proved she had walked through fire and survived. The love she had found was not a pretty, polished thing from a storybook. It was real. It was as raw and honest as the sand and the grit of the desert, and as strong and enduring as the ancient saguaro that stood, patient and proud, against the endless sky. A new, larger sign now hung above the porch of the pump house, its letters painted in a bold, clear hand by Billy Hart. It read, "Water for all, justice for all, a place for all." In the distance, the lonely whistle of an approaching train echoed through the clear morning air. The future was coming, thundering down the iron tracks, a relentless, unstoppable force. But Abigail Boone was not afraid. She smiled, a real, true smile that reached her eyes and crinkled their corners. The train was coming, but this time, she and the people of Dry Creek were the ones driving their own story. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from. So please comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and press the hype button to help our story reach more people.